The sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon, casting an amber glow over the sleepy town of Oak Ridge. It was a quiet evening, the kind where the only sounds you could hear were the distant hum of cicadas and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. But that evening, a storm was brewing in the most unexpected of places. Right on the main street, just outside the old pawn shop that had stood there for decades. A confrontation was about to unfold, one that would shake the town to its core. Nia Jenkins walked down the sidewalk, her mind focused on the errands ahead. She was a woman who had seen her fair share of struggles, but she carried herself with grace and confidence. Her black leather jacket was a little worn, her jeans faded from years of use, but the necklace around her neck gleamed brightly in the fading sunlight. A delicate gold chain with a small, intricate pendant, a family heirloom passed down through generations. For Nia, that necklace wasn't just jewelry. It was a piece of her heritage, a symbol of everything her family had fought through and survived. She had no way of knowing that tonight would change everything. As she neared the corner, a dark figure stepped out from an alleyway, blocking her path. It was Officer Darren Holt, a man she had seen around town before but never paid much attention to. Holt was a cop with a reputation, one that wasn't the best. He had always been known for his sharp words and even sharper attitude. There was something about his presence that made people uneasy, a certain coldness in his eyes that seemed to suggest he felt entitled to more than just authority. "Evening, Mrs. Jenkins," Holt said, his voice smooth, too smooth. "Nice evening, isn't it?" Nia, caught off guard, nodded politely but kept her distance. She had learned long ago to be cautious around certain people, and Holt was definitely one of them. She had heard rumors, whispers about how he treated people differently, depending on who they were and what they looked like. Nia wasn't about to get caught up in his games. Before she could step around him, Holt's hand shot out, grabbing her wrist with a force that made her flinch. "That necklace looks real nice," he said, his grip tightening. "A lady like you doesn't need something like that hanging around her neck." Nia's heart skipped a beat. Was he serious? She had heard stories of cops who abused their power. But this felt different. This was personal. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" Nia asked, trying to pull her arm away. She wasn't intimidated, but the situation was escalating quickly. "I said," Holt repeated, his voice turning icy, "you don't need something so valuable in this neighborhood. I'm just doing my job, ma'am." Before Nia could react, he yanked the necklace from her neck, the chain snapping with a harsh sound as he held it in his palm. Nia gasped, her eyes widening in disbelief. She stared at him, unable to process what had just happened. "Give that back," she demanded, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and shock. But Holt just smirked, the same cold, predatory grin that made Nia's skin crawl. "You should be more careful about what you wear around here, Mrs. Jenkins. Not everyone's as friendly as they seem." Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of the situation. There was no way she could let him get away with this. That necklace wasn't just a piece of jewelry, it was a part of her family's legacy, a piece of her mother's spirit, and it meant more to her than anything. She wasn't about to let some corrupt cop steal it from her without a fight. But just as Nia took a step forward, ready to face Holt head-on, she heard a familiar voice shout from across the street. "Nia, get away from him." It was her son Marcus. Marcus Jenkins was no stranger to Oak Ridge. He had grown up here, learned the value of family, loyalty, and justice from his mother. A few years ago, he had returned to Oak Ridge as the new sheriff, a decision that had raised some eyebrows in town. People remembered the Jenkins name. Marcus's father had been a respected man, but his sudden death had left a scar on the community. Marcus was determined to carry on his father's legacy, but he knew it wouldn't be easy, especially not with officers like Holt around. Marcus' voice was full of authority, but there was something else in it, something more personal. Nia's eyes darted to her son, who was striding toward them, his uniform sharp, his expression serious. His presence was commanding, and it didn't take a second for Holt to recognize who he was. The tension in the air was palpable now. Holt's eyes flicked to Marcus, then back to Nia. For the first time, there was a crack in his cold demeanor, but it was too late for him to back out. Marcus wasn't going to let this slide. The moment of hesitation was all it took for Marcus to cross the street in a few long strides, standing between his mother and the corrupt officer. "You know what, Holt?" Marcus said, his voice low and controlled. "You've crossed a line. A big one." Holt's smirk faltered, he took a step back, glancing at Marcus with a mix of defiance and fear. The two men locked eyes, and in that moment, Nia could feel the weight of the situation pressing in on all of them. This wasn't just about a stolen necklace. It was about power, about respect, and about the dangerous line that was being drawn between good and evil. Nia stepped forward, her voice steady now, her fury giving her strength. "You better give me that necklace back, Holt, or I swear." Before she could finish her sentence, Holt's hand jerked, the necklace falling to the ground with a soft clink. He turned and walked away, but the tension in the air didn't dissipate. Not yet. Marcus bent down to pick it up, his fingers brushing Nia's as he handed it back to her. "Mom, are you okay?" Marcus asked, his concern evident in his voice. Nia nodded, but there was a storm brewing inside her now. A storm that was far from over. She had seen the way Holt had looked at her, the way he had treated her, and she knew that this wouldn't be the last time he'd cross her path. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the moment seemed to fade. But there was no mistaking it. The lines had been drawn, and there was no going back now. Marcus turned to face Holt, his eyes narrowing. "This isn't over," he muttered under his breath. As Holt retreated into the shadows, the quiet town of Oak Ridge seemed to hold its breath. What had just happened was only the beginning of something much bigger. Something that would force the town to confront its darkest secrets and test the very fabric of justice itself. But for now, all anyone could do was wait. Stay tuned for the next part of this story, where things are about to get a whole lot more complicated. The town of Oak Ridge had always been a quiet place, nestled between rolling hills and thick forests that seemed to keep the world at bay. It was a town where everyone knew everyone else's business, where life moved at a slow, almost nostalgic pace. But beneath the surface, hidden in the corners of small-town charm, were darker currents that few dared to acknowledge. Marcus Jenkins had spent most of his life trying to protect the peace of Oak Ridge, but he knew better than anyone that peace could be fragile. He had returned to his hometown after his father's untimely death, a loss that had left a deep scar on the community. Marcus had been young then, too young to take on the weight of the sheriff's badge. But when he came back, it was his only option. His father's passing had left a void that no one else seemed ready to fill. He could feel the eyes of the town on him, a mix of expectations and whispers. Some believed he was too young, too green to carry the title. Others were just waiting for him to fail. But Marcus wasn't the type to back down. He had learned what it meant to fight for what was right, not just from his father but from his mother Nia. She had taught him about resilience, about standing firm in the face of injustice, even when it seemed like the world was stacked against you. The people who had lived through hardships, who had been overlooked, forgotten, or mistreated. Those were the people Marcus wanted to protect. Those were the people who made Oak Ridge what it was, and he swore he would never let that change. Still, he had known something was off in the town ever since he returned. There were whispers, rumors that floated around in the dead of night. Things people barely said aloud, but that were impossible to ignore. His father's death had never been fully explained, and there were murmurs that the sheriff had known too much about things that were better left unknown. Some said it had been an accident. Others, fewer, but more daring, said it was no accident at all. But the longer Marcus stayed, the more he realized how much Oak Ridge had changed since his father's time. Old friends had become distant, new faces seemed to carry hidden agendas, and there were cracks in the system. Cracks that Holt was all too familiar with. Officer Darren Holt had been on the force for as long as Marcus could remember. The man's history was wrapped in as much mystery as Marcus' own. Holt wasn't born in Oak Ridge. He'd come here years ago, just out of nowhere, and had quickly wormed his way into the local police force. In the beginning, no one questioned his presence. He was efficient. He was stern. He followed the rules, at least, most of the time. The longer he was in town, the more unsettling his presence became. There were things about him that didn't quite add up. It wasn't just the way he carried himself or the coldness in his eyes. It was the way people avoided him. The way he manipulated situations without anyone saying a word. Marcus had learned to keep his distance, but lately it had been getting harder to ignore the signs. Holt's behavior had grown more erratic, more aggressive. He was too comfortable with pushing the limits of his authority, taking liberties with his position in ways that made Marcus uneasy. And now, with what had happened today, Marcus felt like the pieces were finally starting to fall into place. He glanced over at his mother, who was still standing there, gripping the necklace tightly in her hand. Her fingers were trembling slightly, but she was doing her best to mask it. Nia was tough, but Marcus knew her well enough to see past the facade. She was shaken, not just by the theft, but by the fact that it was happening in broad daylight, in front of the whole town, without anyone stepping in to stop it. "Are you sure you're okay?" Marcus asked again, his voice softening. Nia nodded, her eyes fixed on the spot where Holt had disappeared into the shadows. "I'll be fine," she said. But her voice had a hardness to it, a determination Marcus recognized. "But that man, he's dangerous, Marcus. You can't just let him get away with this." Marcus looked back down the street, his jaw tightening. The sun had set now, and the streetlights flickered on, casting long shadows across the pavement. The moment with Holt was over, but the feeling of unease remained, settling over him like a heavy fog. "You know, I've been thinking about Holt," Marcus began, his voice low. "Ever since I got back, something's not right with him. I've seen the way he treats people, how he bends the rules to suit his needs. And it's not just today. There have been other incidents, small things that add up to something bigger." Nia's eyes narrowed, and she took a step closer to him. "What are you saying, Marcus?" "I'm saying that Holt might not just be some bad cop," Marcus said, his voice tight with frustration. "He might be connected to something bigger. Something darker." Nia's face darkened at his words. "I've heard the rumors too," she said quietly, "but I didn't want to believe them. Not about Holt. But now, after today, I'm not so sure." Marcus nodded, his mind racing. "There's something off about him. He doesn't just take what he wants. He goes after the people who can't fight back. You, for example. And you're not the first." Nia looked down at the necklace in her hand, her expression softening. "This is more than just about a necklace, Marcus. You know that. He's testing you. Testing me. He wants to see how far he can push before we break." Marcus could feel the weight of his mother's words. This wasn't just about a small-town cop flexing his muscles. This was a power play, a message that things were changing in Oak Ridge. The rules were different now, and Marcus was the one who had to figure out how to stop it before it consumed everything he held dear. "Just be careful," Nia said, her voice steady. "If Holt's involved in something bigger, you need to find out what it is, and fast." Marcus exhaled slowly, his mind already working through the next steps. There was no turning back now. He had to protect his mother, protect the town, and protect the justice his father had fought so hard to uphold. Holt had shown his hand, but Marcus couldn't be sure of what he was dealing with just yet. He needed more information, he needed to dig deeper, but there was one thing Marcus was certain of. The line between right and wrong was about to get a lot blurrier in Oak Ridge. As the night crept on, the streets grew quiet again, but the tension lingered, thick and heavy in the air. Marcus felt it deep in his bones. The storm was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. And when it broke, it would shake Oak Ridge to its very foundation. The night seemed to stretch on longer than usual, and Oak Ridge felt quieter than it had in years. Marcus stood in the middle of the street, the dim light of the street lamps casting long shadows over the empty sidewalks. He felt the weight of the badge on his chest. He had worn it with pride once, but now it felt like a target. Everyone in town expected him to fix everything, to make the bad guys go away, to restore the peace his father had once held so firmly. But Marcus had never faced anything like this before. Holt wasn't just a bad cop. Marcus could feel it in his gut now. There was something much darker lurking beneath the surface, something that wasn't just about corruption or power-hungry individuals. Holt's actions seemed more calculated than that, and the fact that he had targeted his mother, of all people, made it personal. Nia Jenkins wasn't someone you could just push around, and the fact that Holt had done so with such ease told Marcus all he needed to know about the man's confidence. Holt wasn't just acting on impulse, he was testing them. Testing Marcus. He turned to face his mother, who was now walking back toward the house, her steps slow but deliberate. Nia had always been the type to keep her emotions under control, to not let anyone see how deeply something affected her. But Marcus could tell that this had rattled her. She was tough, but no one could withstand that kind of attack without feeling it. The necklace had been more than just an heirloom to her. It was a symbol of everything her family had endured, her mother's resilience, her father's struggles, the sacrifices they had all made to survive and protect what was theirs. For Holt to steal it like that, in front of everyone, was a violation that went beyond theft. It was a declaration of war. As they reached the house, Nia stopped and turned to Marcus. "You need to be careful," she said, her voice low and heavy with warning. "There are things in this town that people have forgotten, or chosen to ignore. Holt's not just some bad cop. He's connected. He's part of something bigger, something deeper. And I think you already know that." Marcus didn't answer right away. He just stood there for a moment, the cool night air brushing against his skin. His thoughts were racing, piecing together fragments of information that he hadn't fully understood before. Holt's strange behavior, the rumors that had always swirled around him, the way people seemed to avoid talking about certain things in front of him. It was all starting to make sense now, but it raised more questions than it answered. "Who's he connected to?" Marcus finally asked, his voice tight. "Who's behind him?" Naya looked away for a second, as if searching for the right words. "I don't know all the details, Marcus, but I've heard things. Old rumors. Some say Holt has ties to people in high places, people who don't want Oak Ridge to change. People who want to keep things the way they've always been, even if it means keeping certain histories buried." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as he realized what his mother was hinting at. Oak Ridge had never been a place without its secrets. There had always been talk about the old families, the ones who had been here for generations, and how some of them had built their wealth and power on foundations that were far from clean. But in all his years growing up here, Marcus had never been able to piece it all together. His father had tried, but whatever truths he had uncovered had died with him. Now, Marcus was starting to understand that those truths hadn't just gone away. They were still lurking in the shadows, waiting for someone to uncover them. "We need to find out who Holt is working for," Marcus said, more to himself than to his mother. "And if we can't get him to talk, we find the people who can make him." Naya looked at him, her face a mask of both concern and pride. "Just be careful, Marcus. You can't fight this fight alone." Marcus nodded, but the weight of the task ahead was already pressing on him. He had been trained to uphold justice, to serve the law. But he was starting to realize that in Oak Ridge, justice wasn't always so clear-cut. There were hidden agendas, old alliances, and a web of power that stretched far beyond what he had ever imagined. Holt wasn't just a rogue officer. He was a cog in a much larger machine, and Marcus didn't yet know how deep the gears turned. That night, after his mother went to bed, Marcus sat alone at the kitchen table, the dim light from the overhead lamp casting long shadows over his thoughts. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through old records, public files, and police reports. Anything that could give him a clearer picture of what Holt was involved in. His mind kept drifting back to the stolen necklace, the way Holt had snatched it from his mother's neck like it was nothing. It wasn't just a crime, it was a power play. Holt had wanted to prove something, to send a message. But what was it? As he dug through the records, his mind kept coming back to one name he had seen mentioned several times: the Caldwell family. They were one of the wealthiest families in Oak Ridge, their fortune built on decades of influence and shady deals that most people in town had either forgotten or chosen to ignore. Marcus had heard whispers of their involvement in local politics, their connections to powerful figures in the state, but it had always been rumors, nothing concrete. But now, as he scrolled through the names of people Holt had worked with in the past, one name kept popping up: Adrian Caldwell. The connection was too strong to ignore. Holt had been seen with Caldwell on several occasions, always at night, always in places that people weren't supposed to be. And then there were the cases Marcus' father had worked on, the ones that had never been solved. Old land disputes, illegal land deals, mysterious disappearances, all pointing to the Caldwells, and all disappearing without a trace. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his mind reeling. It wasn't just Holt he had to worry about anymore. If the Caldwell family was involved, it meant there was a much larger conspiracy at play, one that reached into the heart of Oak Ridge itself. And Holt was right in the middle of it. The next few days were a blur of careful observations, whispered conversations, and digging into every lead he could find. Holt had gone into hiding, at least, it seemed that way. He wasn't showing up to work, wasn't answering calls. But Marcus knew it was only a matter of time before the officer would resurface, and when he did, Marcus would be ready. But something in the back of his mind kept nagging at him. Holt wasn't the only danger. There were others in this town, others with secrets they were willing to kill to protect. As much as Marcus wanted to follow the trail, he knew he couldn't do it alone. There were too many people who might be watching, too many people with a vested interest in keeping Oak Ridge's secrets buried. And soon, Marcus would have to decide just how far he was willing to go to uncover the truth. The storm that was building in Oak Ridge wasn't just a metaphor. It was real, and it was coming. Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in on him. Every day, Oak Ridge felt a little smaller, a little more suffocating. The quiet town he had returned to seemed to be hiding something much darker, something that no one wanted to admit. The whispers he had overheard in the town, the secrets that had been buried for decades, were starting to surface, and it was all leading back to Holt. But Holt was only a piece of the puzzle. A pawn in a game much bigger than Marcus had anticipated, and now he had to figure out how to bring everything into the light without it all collapsing on top of him. Marcus spent the next few days gathering information, asking questions in hushed voices, keeping his distance from anyone who might tip off the wrong people. It was dangerous work, the kind of investigation that made you look over your shoulder every few minutes. But he had to do it. He had to find out how deep the corruption ran. The more he dug, the clearer it became that the Caldwell family was at the center of it all. And if he was going to take down Holt, he would have to expose the Caldwells and everyone connected to them. But there were other forces at play. Marcus had noticed it the night Holt had stolen his mother's necklace. The way people seemed to avoid speaking freely, the way they shut their doors a little quicker when he passed by. People in Oak Ridge didn't want to be dragged into anything too dangerous. They wanted to forget about the past, to live their lives in peace, even if that meant turning a blind eye to the rot beneath the surface. It was one afternoon, just a few days after that tense encounter with Holt, that Marcus received an unexpected visitor. He was sitting in his office at the sheriff's department, poring over case files, when there was a knock on his door. It wasn't unusual for someone to drop by, but the person standing in the doorway made his stomach tighten with unease. It was Deputy Nora Hayes, a longtime friend of Marcus's family. She had always been someone he could trust, someone who had worked alongside his father for years, but the look on her face now was different. There was a nervousness in her eyes, a hesitation in her step that Marcus couldn't ignore. "Marcus," she said, her voice low, almost too quiet. "We need to talk." He stood up immediately, his mind already racing. "What's going on, Nora?" She stepped inside, closing the door behind her. "I've been hearing things," she said, her gaze darting toward the window, as if expecting someone to be watching. "About Holt. About the Caldwells. There's more to all of this than you realize." Marcus' heart skipped a beat. He had been trying to piece things together for days, but he hadn't expected anyone else to be in the know. Nora had always kept to herself, never one to speak out unless it was absolutely necessary. So if she was speaking now, it meant something big was unfolding, something dangerous. "I think you're getting too close to something," Nora continued, her voice shaking just slightly. "I know what happened to your father wasn't just an accident. There are people who want you to stop digging, and they'll do anything to make that happen." Marcus' mind was racing. His father's death had always felt off to him, but he had never been able to prove anything. Was it possible that it hadn't been a heart attack after all? That it had been part of something bigger, something darker? "What do you know, Nora?" he asked, his voice steady despite the rush of adrenaline surging through him. "Tell me everything." Nora hesitated, looking over her shoulder before speaking again. "I can't give you all the details. But I know Holt's been working with the Caldwells for a long time. There's something going on. Something." "Illegal. And it's not just about money, it's bigger than that. Your father. He was getting too close to the truth, and they couldn't let him keep digging. Not if he was going to expose them." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. His father had always been careful, always stayed within the law. But now, Nora's words were spinning a new reality. One where his father's death wasn't just a tragic event, but a calculated move to keep something hidden. "Nora," Marcus said, his voice hardening. "If you know something, you have to tell me. I need to understand what happened to him." what they're hiding. She glanced nervously toward the door again, her face pale. I wish I could, Marcus, but you don't understand. If they find out I've said anything, they'll come after me too. You don't know how deep this goes. Holt, he's not just some rogue officer. He's part of something much bigger. There are people who control Oak Ridge, and they will do anything to keep their power. Marcus clenched his fists. Every word Nora spoke confirmed his worst fears, but it also lit a fire in him. Whoever had killed his father, whoever was behind this, they had underestimated him. They had underestimated the will of the people in Oak Ridge. And he wasn't about to let them get away with it. Not now. Not after everything his family had sacrificed. I don't care what it takes, Marcus said, his voice low and determined. I'm going to take them down. All of them. Nora looked at him, her eyes filled with both fear and admiration. Be careful, Marcus. I'm telling you this because I trust you, but you can't fight this alone. There are people in town who still believe in what's right. You need to find them. You need to make allies. Marcus nodded, his mind already racing through his options. The Caldwells, Holt, the network of corruption. It was all too big for one man to take down on his own. But maybe, just maybe, with the right people by his side, he could make it work. Just as he was about to ask Nora for more details, the door to his office swung open. A figure stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the hallway light. The sudden appearance of the figure sent a jolt of tension through Marcus, his body instantly on high alert. It was Holt. The officer's eyes locked onto Marcus with a cold, almost predatory gaze. And for the first time, Marcus saw something he hadn't expected, a flicker of fear in Holt's eyes. You've been asking too many questions, Sheriff, Holt's voice came, low and menacing. And now, you're going to learn what happens when you dig too deep. The tension in the room thickened, the air heavy with unspoken threats. Marcus knew then that there was no turning back. The final pieces were in place, and the game was about to get much more dangerous. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach. The storm that had been brewing for so long was finally going to break. And when it did, no one in Oak Ridge would be safe. The tension in the room snapped as Holt stepped further inside, the door creaking shut behind him. Marcus didn't flinch, but his mind was already spinning, calculating his next move. Holt's posture was too rigid, his eyes too focused, as if he had been waiting for this moment, waiting for Marcus to finally come too close to the truth. You've been asking questions, Sheriff, Holt said again, his voice lower now, but still carrying the same menacing tone. You should know better than to dig into things that aren't meant for you. Marcus narrowed his eyes, his heart pounding in his chest. What do you want, Holt? He asked, his voice calm but laced with anger. You've already crossed the line. You can't intimidate me. Holt's lips twitched into a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. I don't need to intimidate you, Marcus. I just need you to understand what you're up against. The way Holt spoke, the way his words seemed to hang in the air, sent a chill down Marcus's spine. There was something else, something deeper, behind Holt's cryptic tone. It wasn't just the Caldwells or his twisted alliance with them that had him rattled. It was the way Holt seemed to know exactly what Marcus was thinking, as if this entire confrontation had been planned long before Marcus had even set foot in Oak Ridge. Marcus took a step forward, pushing back the unease that threatened to show on his face. I've been figuring you out, Holt, and you're not going to stop me from finding out what happened to my father. I'm not afraid of you. For a moment, Holt didn't respond. He just stood there silent, staring at Marcus with that same cold, calculating gaze. Then, with a sudden movement, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small envelope. He tossed it onto the desk in front of Marcus. The weight of the gesture hit Marcus before he even looked inside. You think you're the first one to try this? Holt said, his voice soft but intense. You're playing. With fire, Sheriff. And the truth has a way of burning everyone, even those who think they can handle it. Marcus stared at the envelope, his stomach sinking. He hesitated for a moment before picking it up, his fingers brushing the paper. He could feel the heaviness of the moment, the weight of what was about to unfold. With a deep breath, he opened it, pulling out the single sheet of paper inside. His eyes scanned the letter quickly, the words leaping out at him like daggers. The message was simple, but it hit him like a punch to the gut. Your father was a liability. He knew too much. And if you keep digging, you'll join him in the ground. Consider this a warning, Marcus. If you love Oak Ridge, you'll stop before it's too late. Marcus's breath caught in his throat. He couldn't breathe. His mind raced to process the words, to make sense of the implications. Someone very powerful, had been keeping tabs on him, on his every move. But who? And why was Holt so involved? Holt had always been a shadow, lurking at the edges of every investigation, but now it was clear he was more than just an enforcer for the Caldwells. He was a messenger, a tool used to keep the truth buried. As Marcus's thoughts scrambled, he didn't notice the shift in Holt's expression. For the first time, there was something more than coldness in his eyes, something darker, something almost pitying. You really don't know, do you? Holt said, his voice now a strange mix of pity and amusement. You think this is just about your father? About Oak Ridge? It's not, Marcus. This goes much deeper than your little town. And it's not just about the Caldwells. There are people in this world who pull strings you'll never see. People who play a game much bigger than you could ever imagine, and you're out of your league. Marcus's pulse raced, the pieces starting to fall into place, but they were still too scattered. Holt's words were unsettling, like a puzzle missing half its pieces. The Caldwells, the land deals, his father's death. It all seemed like it was leading somewhere bigger, but Marcus couldn't grasp the full picture. What game? Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper, the gravity of Holt's words settling into his bones. What do you mean? But before Holt could answer, the door behind them suddenly burst open with a crash. The sound of footsteps pounding against the wooden floor. Both men turned in surprise, their eyes meeting the newcomer who stood in the doorway, silhouetted in the harsh light from the hallway. It was Nora. But something about her was different, her face pale, her eyes wide with panic. She wasn't here to help. She wasn't here to warn Marcus. She was here to deliver news that would shatter everything he thought he knew. They know, she said, her voice shaking. They know everything, Marcus. The Caldwells, Holt. They know what you've been doing. Marcus' heart dropped into his stomach. What do you mean, Nora? Before she could answer, there was a loud crash from the hallway, followed by shouts. Marcus spun around, his instincts taking over. The tension in the room escalated in an instant. He had no idea who was out there, but the urgency in Nora's voice told him everything he needed to know. Whoever was coming, they weren't here for a casual conversation. Holt's face hardened, and his hands subtly shifted toward his side, as if preparing for something. I warned you, Marcus, he said, his voice low and dangerous. But now it's too late. Suddenly the door flew open again, and a group of men rushed into the room, men Marcus didn't recognize. They were dressed in dark clothes, their faces hidden behind masks, their movements fast and deliberate. Marcus' heart raced as he took in the situation. This was no ordinary raid. These men weren't here for a simple confrontation. They were here to silence him, once and for all. Nora stepped in front of him, her body shaking. Marcus, you need to leave. Now. They won't stop until you're gone. But it was too late. One of the masked men lunged forward, grabbing Marcus by the arm and pulling him toward the door. The room erupted in chaos, Holt standing off to the side, watching without moving, his expression unreadable. What do you think you're doing? Marcus spat, struggling to break free. But before he could fight back, another man moved in, slamming him against the wall, the impact knocking the breath out of him. The world spun for a moment as Marcus's head hit the hard surface. He struggled to focus, to think clearly, but everything was moving too fast. You should have stayed out of it, Sheriff, the man said, his voice cold. But now, you've made your choice, and we don't take kindly to people who disrupt our plans. Through the fog of pain and confusion, Marcus realized the worst possible truth. This wasn't just about Holt. This was about something far more dangerous, far more powerful than he had ever imagined. Caldwell's were only the beginning, and as the masked men dragged him away, the world seemed to tilt on its axis, leaving Marcus with only one terrifying thought. He had been right all along. There was a force in Oak Ridge that controlled everything, and now, it was coming for him. The world was a blur as Marcus struggled against the grip of the men who were dragging him through the cold, sterile hallways of what felt like a forgotten part of the sheriff's department. His head throbbed where he'd been slammed into the wall, his vision still swimming with the echoes of the attack. But one thing was clear, this was no ordinary kidnapping. No ordinary threat. The darkness he had uncovered in Oak Ridge was about to swallow him whole. They were going to silence him for good. "Where are you taking me?" Marcus managed to choke out, his voice hoarse from the impact. His body was stiff, but the adrenaline was pumping through him now, giving him strength he didn't even know he had left. He fought to stay conscious, to stay in control. But the overwhelming sense of danger was suffocating. The man holding his arm didn't answer, just kept pulling him forward with cold, mechanical efficiency. Another figure walked ahead of them, a large silhouette in the dim light, someone important, someone in charge. Marcus tried to focus on the footsteps, trying to make out any details. But his mind was clouded by the pounding pain in his skull. They shoved him into a small, dark room, and the door slammed shut behind him, the sound echoing like a death knell. He barely had time to steady himself before one of the masked men roughly pushed him to his knees, the sharp bite of the cold concrete floor grounding him to the present. The other men stood back, their eyes cold, their movements stiff, like soldiers ready to follow orders. For a moment, the room was silent, save for the sound of Marcus's breath and the ringing in his ears. And then, from the shadows, a voice spoke, deep and unsettling. "You should have listened, Marcus," the voice said. "You should have stayed out of it." Marcus' heart skipped a beat. The voice was familiar, too familiar. His stomach twisted as the figure stepped forward into the dim light. It was Holt. But this wasn't the Holt Marcus had known. The cop who had always been an enigma. A shadow moving just beyond reach. This man standing in front of him now was something else. He was cold, calculated, and every ounce of humanity seemed drained from his eyes. "You've been a problem for too long," Holt continued, his eyes never leaving Marcus. "You should have stayed quiet. Should have let things play out like your father did. But you didn't. You wanted to be a hero, Marcus. Now look where that's got you." Marcus swallowed hard, trying to stay composed. "You're just a puppet, Holt. You've been controlled from the start, and I'm not going to stop until I take you all down." Holt's lips curled into a thin smile. "You still don't get it, do you?" He stepped closer, his voice lowering to a whisper. "There's no taking us down. We're too far gone. Oak Ridge belongs to us, Marcus. It always has." The words hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. He had suspected it, had felt it in his bones, but hearing it out loud felt like a dagger through the heart. The Caldwells, the corruption, the manipulation. They weren't just isolated incidents. They were the fabric that had kept Oak Ridge alive for decades, weaving a web so tangled that no one, not even the sheriff, could hope to untangle it. They had controlled everything. And now, they were going to make sure Marcus never breathed another word about it. "I didn't want it to come to this," Holt said, his voice almost remorseful. "But you pushed us. You left us no choice." Marcus' mind raced. He couldn't let this be the end. He wouldn't. He had to fight. But as the masked men closed in on him, the weight of his situation sank in. He had no allies left, no more leads. His mother was vulnerable. His friends were scattered. The Caldwells controlled everything. This was the moment. It would either end with him dying in some forgotten corner of the world, or it would end with Oak Ridge being burned to the ground. Then, just as the man beside Holt reached into his jacket to pull out a gun, there was a loud bang, sharp and echoing through the room. The masked man fell to the ground, clutching his chest, his face frozen in a look of shock. Holt's eyes darted toward the door, his expression shifting from cold calculation to something closer to panic. The gunshot rang out again, and another man dropped to the floor, his body crumpling like a rag doll. "What the hell?" Holt growled, spinning toward the doorway, his hand instinctively reaching for the weapon at his side. Before he could draw it, the door burst open, and a figure stepped in. A silhouette that Marcus could barely make out in the darkness. But the sound of boots on the floor was unmistakable. "Get away from him." The voice was clear, commanding, strong. Marcus's pulse quickened as the figure stepped into the light. It was Nora. But she wasn't alone. Behind her were two other people, familiar faces. Sheriff Thompson's former partner, a retired investigator named Leo Rucker, and a tall man with a rough-hewn face that Marcus recognized immediately. It was Sam Caldwell. But it wasn't the Sam Caldwell Marcus had known as the calm, calculating patriarch. This was a man who had clearly decided that the time for games was over. "Get down, Marcus," Nora barked, and before Marcus could react, he felt the sharp force of her hand pushing him out of harm's way. She and the others began taking positions in the room, their weapons aimed squarely at Holt and the remaining masked men. Holt's face twisted with rage, but he wasn't stupid enough to try anything. He understood, just as Marcus did, that the game had changed in an instant. "You think you've won?" Holt spat. "This isn't over. You don't know what you've just walked into. You don't understand what's coming." Sam Caldwell stepped forward, his eyes locked on Holt. "No, Holt. I think you don't understand what's coming." For the first time, Holt's confidence faltered, and a flicker of realization crossed his face. His entire world was crumbling. Nora turned to Marcus, her voice steady. "You've been playing with fire, but sometimes it's the right people who bring it down." She nodded towards Sam. "We've known about you, Holt. The Caldwells may have controlled Oak Ridge for years, but they've been slipping. We've had eyes on the inside for longer than you realize, and your time has run out." Marcus' mind was spinning. It didn't make sense. Sam Caldwell, the same family he had been investigating, was now standing here, helping him take down Holt. "I don't understand," Marcus managed to say, still disoriented. "What's going on?" Sam smiled grimly. "There's more to Oak Ridge than the Caldwells. And there's a lot more to my family than you ever knew. Holt's just a pawn, Marcus. He was always a pawn, but now, things are going to change." Suddenly, the ground beneath Marcus's feet seemed to shift. Holt wasn't the final enemy after all. And Oak Ridge, the place he thought he knew, had always been a battlefield for power much greater than he had imagined. Before Holt could respond, the door to the room swung open one last time, revealing a new figure standing there. Someone who made Marcus's blood run cold. It was his mother, Nia. But her expression was completely different from anything he'd ever seen before. It was hard, resolute, and when she spoke, her voice echoed with finality. "Marcus, it's time to end this." And with that, everything changed. The real battle was just beginning. But it wasn't about just the Caldwells, Holt, or even Oak Ridge anymore. It was about everything they had built, and everything they were about to destroy. Marcus's heart slammed in his chest as he looked at his mother. The shock of seeing her here, standing before him, was overwhelming. She wasn't just some bystander, she was involved. He had spent so many nights trying to piece together the truth about Oak Ridge, about the Caldwells, about Holt. And now, with his mother standing here, it felt like the final piece had fallen into place. But he still couldn't grasp it. "Mom," Marcus managed to ask, his voice cracking with disbelief. "What's going on? Why didn't you tell me?" Nia's gaze softened, but there was no hesitation in her voice. "I didn't want you to get caught in this, Marcus. I knew how dangerous it would be for you." She stepped closer, her expression hardening. "But the truth is, the Caldwells have never been in control of Oak Ridge. Not really. They were always just a front. It's been a game all along, and your father, he knew it. He was the only one who ever saw the full picture, and they couldn't let him keep exposing it. So they killed him." Marcus's head spun. His father hadn't just died of natural causes. He had been murdered. And it was all connected to the Caldwells, to Holt, to the corruption that ran deep in Oak Ridge. But the puzzle was bigger than he had ever imagined. His mother continued, her voice growing more urgent. "It's not just about land deals and money, Marcus. There are powerful people, national players, who've been using Oak Ridge as a chessboard for years. The Caldwells? They're just the middlemen. The real players are untouchable, invisible. Your father, he knew they were pulling the strings, and that's why he was dangerous to them." Sam Caldwell, standing just behind Mia, spoke up, his voice gravelly. "The family had their hands in a lot more than land, Marcus. Your father and I, we had our differences, but he was onto something big. Something that could have brought the whole system down. And they couldn't let that happen." It was all too much to process. Marcus felt his chest tighten, a mix of anger and sadness overwhelming. Him. His father had been murdered to protect a system of corruption that stretched far beyond Oak Ridge. And his mother, the woman he had trusted his entire life, had been part of it. But there was something in her eyes now, something that told him she was on his side. She wasn't the enemy. She had been forced into this life, just like him. But why, Mom? Why didn't you tell me any of this? Why did you let me keep going down this path? Marcus's voice shook with frustration. Nia's eyes filled with tears, but her expression remained firm. I wanted to protect you, Marcus. You're my son. I wanted you to live a normal life. I didn't want you to carry this burden, but the truth is, you're not just any sheriff. You're your father's son. And now, you've inherited his fight. I couldn't keep running from it, not anymore. Marcus stood there in stunned silence, trying to process everything. Holt, standing across from them, had begun to fidget, shifting his weight from foot to foot. It was clear he was trying to make sense of what was happening, but he wasn't getting the answers he wanted. His once cocky demeanor had completely faltered, and it was now clear that the man who had been so sure of himself was losing control. Nora stepped forward, her voice steady. You're done, Holt. The game's over. For the first time, Holt's mask cracked. His face twisted into a mixture of rage and disbelief. You think you can take me down? You think I'm scared of you? But Marcus, still processing his mother's words, stepped forward, his voice calm but unwavering. No, Holt. I think you're scared of them. He nodded towards Sam and Mia. You were just their pawn. The Caldwells were never in charge. You were always expendable. Holt's expression darkened, but there was a flicker of fear in his eyes. He glanced around the room, trying to size up his options, but it was too late. The game was over. He had played his part, but now he was out of moves. We have everything we need, Holt, Sam said, his voice low and decisive. All the records, all the evidence. You'll be facing more than just Oak Ridge. This goes national. This goes global. There's no way out. Marcus couldn't help but feel a sense of grim satisfaction as he watched Holt's confidence crumble. For so long, Holt had been the threat looming over Oak Ridge, but now he was just a scared man trying to salvage whatever control he had left. You're finished, Nora added, stepping closer to Marcus. The Caldwells won't have any power left. It's time for Oak Ridge to be free. As Holt opened his mouth to protest, the door to the room creaked open again, and the unmistakable sound of sirens wailed in the distance. The cavalry had arrived. The real authorities were here, and they weren't going to let Holt slip away this time. The rest of the night played out quickly. Holt was arrested, the remaining members of his operation were rounded up, and Sam Caldwell, surprisingly, helped to ensure that everything was properly documented. Marcus didn't fully understand Sam's role in all of this, but there was no denying that he had played a pivotal part in dismantling the network that had poisoned Oak Ridge for years. As for his mother Nia, her involvement wasn't as black and white as Marcus had initially thought. She had been a part of the system, but it was clear now that she had always been fighting it in her own way, even if it had taken her too long to take the final steps. As the dust settled, and Holt was led away in handcuffs, Marcus found himself standing in the middle of the room with his mother by his side. For the first time in what felt like forever, the weight on his shoulders began to lift. The town that had once felt like a cage now seemed different. The future of Oak Ridge was uncertain, but Marcus knew one thing: the people who had held its future hostage no longer had the power. Nia turned to him, her eyes filled with a quiet sadness. I'm sorry, Marcus, for everything. Marcus looked at her, really looked at her, and saw the woman who had tried to protect him, even if it had meant keeping the truth from him. You did what you thought was best. But you're right. It's over now. As the sun began to rise over Oak Ridge, casting the town in the soft glow of a new day, Marcus felt a flicker of hope. It was a long road ahead, one filled with uncertainty, but for the first time, Oak Ridge felt like a place that could change. It had taken too long, but the truth had finally come to light. And as Marcus stood with his mother Sam and Nora, he realized that this was just the beginning. The past couldn't be erased, but the future was still his to shape. And for the first time in a long while, Marcus believed that change was possible. Oak Ridge had been broken, but now it had the chance to heal.